The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic and straightened his bearskin hat. At 28, he had been serving as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace for 3 years, standing motionless for hours while tourists snapped photos and made jokes about the toy soldiers. His colleagues knew him as the quiet one, the guard who never boasted about his past or joined in the rough banter that filled the barracks. Today was different. The annual inter-regiment shooting competition had arrived, and every unit was required to send representatives to the firing range. James had tried to avoid it, preferring to keep his head down and maintain his carefully constructed image of an ordinary guardsman. But Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had other plans. Mitchell, the commanding officer, barked across the parade ground. "You're representing the guards today. Don't embarrass us." James nodded silently, knowing there was no point in arguing. He had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, of blending into the background while carrying secrets that would shock his fellow soldiers. As he walked toward the armory to collect his rifle, he could hear the snickers from the other guards. "Poor Mitchell," whispered Guardsman Peters to his mate. "He can barely hit the side of a barn during regular training. This is going to be embarrassing." The truth was far more complicated. James had deliberately performed poorly during standard shooting drills, missing targets that any trained soldier should hit easily. It wasn't incompetence, it was camouflage. Every missed shot was calculated. Every fumbled reload was an act designed to maintain his cover. At the firing range, representatives from various military units had gathered. The parachute regiment soldiers strutted around with confidence, their reputation as elite fighters preceding them. The Royal Marines cracked jokes while cleaning their weapons with practiced efficiency. Members of the King's Royal Rifle Corps whispered among themselves about previous competitions they had dominated. James found himself assigned to Lane 7, between a cocky corporal from the Welsh Guards and a seasoned sergeant from the Coldstream Guards. As he unpacked his equipment, he noticed the other competitors eyeing him with barely concealed amusement. "Look what we have here," said Corporal Davies from the Welsh Guards, his Welsh accent thick with mockery. "One of those palace pretty boys. Bet you're better at standing still than shooting, eh, mate?" The Coldstream Guard sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Thompson, shook his head sympathetically. "Don't worry, lad. We all have to start somewhere. Just try not to hit the safety officer." Laughter rippled through the nearby lanes as word spread about the ceremonial guard, who had been forced to compete. James said nothing, methodically checking his rifle and adjusting his position. Inside, old instincts were stirring. Muscle memory from a life he had left behind, skills that had once made him the most feared marksman in the British military's most elite unit. The range officer's voice boomed across the field. "Gentlemen, today's competition consists of 3 phases. Standard target shooting at 100 meters, moving targets at 200 meters, and precision shooting at 400 meters. Each phase will test different aspects of your marksmanship. May the best shot win." As the competitors took their positions for the first phase, James caught sight of someone in the observation area that made his blood run cold. A tall man in civilian clothes stood apart from the other spectators, his sharp eyes scanning the firing line. Colonel Richard Blackwood, former commanding officer of 22 Special Air Service Regiment, the man who knew exactly who James Mitchell really was. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the range. Blackwood's expression was unreadable, but James could see the slight nod, a recognition that sent a chill down his spine. After 3 years of anonymity, his past had found him. The first phase began with standard prone position shooting. James watched as the other competitors fired their rounds, most achieving respectable groupings on their targets. When his turn came, he deliberately pulled his shot slightly off-center, maintaining his facade of mediocrity while his mind raced with questions about Blackwood's presence. "Decent effort. Palace boy," Davies called out mockingly as James's target was scored. "Maybe stick to marching in parades." But Blackwood was still watching, and James realized that his carefully constructed new life was about to crumble. The shooting competition had become something far more dangerous than a simple test of marksmanship. It had become a moment of reckoning with a past he had tried desperately to forget. As the competitors prepared for the second phase, James found himself at a crossroads. He could continue the charade, accept the humiliation, and hope that Blackwood would respect his desire for anonymity. Or he could show these soldiers what 3 years in the shadows of Buckingham Palace had hidden that they were competing against a man who had once been considered the deadliest sniper in the most elite military unit in the world. The weight of his rifle felt familiar in his hands, and for the first time in 3 years, James Mitchell began to remember who he used to be. The question was whether he was ready to become that person again, knowing that once the truth came out, there would be no going back to his quiet life as just another royal guard. The second phase of the competition began with moving targets at 200 meters. Clay discs would be launched at varying speeds and angles, testing the shooter's ability to track and engage dynamic threats. James watched as the first competitors stepped up to the line, their confident demeanor from the previous round still intact. Corporal Davies went first, managing to hit 6 out of 10 targets, a respectable score that earned approving nods from his Welsh Guards comrades. Sergeant Thompson followed with 7 hits, his experience showing in the smooth way he tracked the targets. One by one, the competitors took their turns with scores ranging from 5 to 8 successful hits. "Mitchell, you're up," called the range officer. James stepped forward, aware of the whispered comments and barely suppressed laughter from the other lanes. He could feel Blackwood's intense gaze from the observation area, and something inside him began to shift. The years of suppressed instincts started to surface like water finding cracks in a dam. "Ready on the firing point," the range officer announced. James shouldered his rifle, his breathing automatically falling into the rhythm he had learned years ago in the windswept mountains of Afghanistan. The first clay disc launched into the air, spinning lazily against the cloudy sky. For a split second, time seemed to slow. His body moved with fluid precision, the rifle tracking the target with mechanical smoothness. The clay exploded into orange fragments. A murmur rippled through the nearby competitors, but James was already tracking the second target. Another clean hit, then a third. The whispered conversations died away as the 4th, 5th, and 6th targets disintegrated in perfect succession. "Bloody hell," muttered Thompson under his breath. James barely heard him. He was somewhere else now, his mind transported back to the Hindu Kush, where missing a shot meant the difference between life and death for his squadron. The 7th target launched at a steep angle, but his rifle found it effortlessly. The 8th came in low and fast, but it might as well have been standing still. 9 targets destroyed, 10 targets destroyed. Perfect score. The range fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic from the main road. James lowered his rifle, suddenly aware that every eye on the firing line was focused on him. The mocking expressions had vanished, replaced by confusion and dawning respect. "Well, I'll be damned," Davies said quietly, his earlier cockiness completely gone. "Where did that come from?" James said nothing, but he could feel the careful walls he had built around his identity beginning to crumble. In the observation area, Blackwood was no longer just watching. He was smiling, a predatory expression that James remembered all too well. The third phase was precision shooting at 400 meters, the most challenging discipline. Here, competitors would fire at small targets in various wind conditions, testing not just accuracy, but the ability to read environmental factors and adjust accordingly. It was the kind of shooting that separated trained soldiers from true marksmen. As the other competitors took their turns, James tried to rebuild his mental defenses. He could still throw the final phase, make some obvious mistakes, and pass off his previous performance as beginner's luck. But the damage was already done. Word was spreading through the range like wildfire. "Did you see that Royal Guards shooting?" he heard someone whisper. 10 out of 10 on moving targets. That's Special Forces level accuracy. Who is that guy? The precision phase began with the most challenging competitors going first. The parachute regiment's best marksmen managed an impressive grouping, all shots within the 8 ring. The Royal Marines representative did even better, with most shots in the 9 ring and 2 in the 10. When James's turn came, a small crowd had gathered behind the firing line. Word of the Palace Guard's unexpected performance had drawn spectators from other areas of the training ground. He could feel their eyes on him as he took his position. The 400-meter target looked impossibly small through his scope, but James's hands were steady as he checked the wind flags and adjusted his scope accordingly. The breeze was coming from the northwest at approximately 8 miles per hour, with occasional gusts that would require quick adjustments. His first shot rang out across the range. Through his scope, James could see the small hole appear dead center in the 10 ring. A ripple of amazement went through the crowd behind him. The second shot followed with mechanical precision. Another 10. By the fifth shot, the crowd had grown silent, watching with the kind of tense attention usually reserved for championship events. James was operating on pure instinct now, his conscious mind barely involved in the process. Each shot flowed into the next with the fluid grace of a dancer or the deadly efficiency of a machine designed for one purpose. 10 shots. 10 perfect 10s. The range officer walked down range to examine the target, his expression one of disbelief. When he returned, he held up the target for all to see. The 10 shots formed a cluster so tight that they could have been covered by a 20-pence coin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the range officer announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent range, "we have a new range record." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but James felt only a growing sense of dread. In the observation area, Blackwood was walking toward the firing line, his civilian clothes doing nothing to disguise the predatory confidence of a man who had once commanded the most elite soldiers in the British military, as his fellow competitors crowded around him with congratulations and amazed questions. James realized that his 3 years of anonymity were over. The quiet royal guard who had stood motionless outside Buckingham Palace had just revealed skills that belonged to a very different kind of soldier, the kind who operated in the shadows, far from the ceremonial duties and tourist cameras. The truth was coming out, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The crowd pressed closer as James stepped back from the firing line, their earlier mockery replaced by genuine amazement and 1,000 questions. Corporal Davies, who had been the loudest critic just hours earlier, now looked at him with something approaching awe. "Mate, that was incredible," Davies said, extending his hand. "I owe you an apology. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Before James could answer, a familiar voice cut through the congratulations like a blade through silk. "Sergeant Mitchell, isn't it?" The crowd parted as Colonel Blackwood approached, his civilian clothes and casual demeanor doing nothing to diminish his commanding presence. James felt his stomach drop as every head turned toward them, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "Sir," James replied stiffly, unsure of the proper protocol for addressing his former commanding officer in this setting. Blackwood's eyes held a glimmer of amusement as he surveyed the target that still hung in James's lane. "Impressive shooting. Very impressive indeed. Tell me, how long have you been with the Guards?" 3 years, sir." 3 years, Blackwood repeated thoughtfully, loud enough for the gathered soldiers to hear. "And before that?" James felt the trap closing around him. Every eye was focused on their exchange, waiting for an answer that would explain the impossible accuracy they had just witnessed. He could lie, deflect, or simply refuse to answer, but Blackwood's presence made it clear that the choice was no longer his to make. "I served elsewhere, sir." "Elsewhere?" Blackwood smiled, the expression predatory and knowing. "Yes, I imagine you did. Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the crowd that had gathered around them, "allow me to introduce you to someone rather special." James closed his eyes briefly, knowing what was coming. "This man," Blackwood continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "is not just any royal guard. 3 years ago, he was Sergeant James Mitchell of 22 Special Air Service Regiment. More specifically, he was the finest sniper the SAS has produced in the past decade." The silence that followed was deafening. James could feel the weight of dozens of stares, the sudden shift in how every person around him was processing his presence. The mockery and casual dismissal had evaporated, replaced by something between respect and disbelief. "The SAS?" whispered Sergeant Thompson, his gruff voice barely audible. "You were regiment?" Blackwood wasn't finished. "Sergeant Mitchell holds the record for the longest confirmed kill in SAS history. 2,100 meters in Afghanistan, during Operation Herrick. He saved an entire patrol that was pinned down by Taliban snipers in the mountains near Kajaki." The crowd pressed closer, their earlier casual interest transformed into the intense focus that soldiers reserved for war stories and legends. James stood perfectly still, feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with the careful life he had built crumbling around him. "But that's not all," Blackwood continued, clearly enjoying the revelation. "Over 3 tours in Afghanistan, Sergeant Mitchell was credited with 47 confirmed kills, each one a precision shot that eliminated threats to British forces. He was recommended for the Distinguished Conduct Medal twice and the Military Cross once. Davies stared at James as if seeing him for the first time. 47 confirmed kills? And you've been standing guard duty at Buckingham Palace? Why? Asked Thompson, the question that was on everyone's mind. Why would someone with your record end up in the guards? James finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent crowd. Sometimes a man needs to find a different kind of service. It was a partial truth, carefully crafted to avoid the real reasons for his transfer. The nightmares that had started after his third tour. The way his hands would shake when he held a rifle. The growing certainty that he had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. The request for transfer to ceremonial duties had been his attempt to find peace, to serve his country in a way that didn't involve looking through a scope at human targets. Blackwood studied him with the intense gaze that James remembered from countless mission briefings. Indeed, but it seems that certain skills never truly fade, do they? I suppose not, sir. The range officer approached with a clipboard, clearly overwhelmed by the revelation. Sergeant Mitchell, your score today sets a new record for this competition. In fact, it's the highest score ever recorded on this range by any unit. Around them, soldiers from various regiments began introducing themselves, their earlier dismissive attitudes replaced by genuine respect. The parachute regiment marksman who had been so confident earlier approached with his hand extended. Mate, it's an honor to shoot alongside you. I've heard stories about SAS snipers, but I never thought I'd meet one. More introductions followed, each soldier eager to shake hands with someone they now recognized as a legitimate military legend. James accepted their respect with polite acknowledgement, but inside he felt a growing anxiety. The attention was exactly what he had spent 3 years trying to avoid. There's something else, Blackwood said, his voice cutting through the congratulations. The reason I'm here today isn't coincidental. We've been monitoring the competition, looking for exceptional marksmen for a special assignment. James felt his blood run cold. Sir, there's a situation developing that requires someone with very specific skills. Someone who can make impossible shots under extreme pressure. Someone who has proven himself in the most challenging combat environments. The crowd fell silent again, sensing that they were witnessing something significant unfold. James looked around at the faces surrounding him. Soldiers who minutes earlier had seen him as nothing more than a ceremonial guard, now hanging on every word of a conversation that was reshaping their understanding of who he really was. With respect, sir, James said carefully, I'm no longer that soldier. Blackwood's smile was knowing and cold. Today's demonstration suggests otherwise. You can't hide who you are forever, Mitchell. Some skills are too valuable to waste on parade duties. As James stood surrounded by soldiers who now knew his secret, he realized that his carefully constructed new life had not just been exposed, it was about to be completely dismantled. That evening, James sat alone in the guards' mess hall, pushing food around his plate while his mind raced through the implications of the day's events. Word of his identity had spread through the barracks like wildfire, and the atmosphere around him had completely changed. Fellow guardsmen who had barely acknowledged him for 3 years now approached with a mixture of respect and curiosity that made him deeply uncomfortable. Is it true you once shot a Taliban commander from over 2 kilometers away? Asked Guardsman Phillips, a young soldier who had joined the regiment only 6 months earlier. James looked up from his untouched dinner. That's not something I discuss. But the colonel said. The colonel said a lot of things, James interrupted gently but firmly. Some stories are better left in the past. Phillips nodded respectfully and moved away, but James could feel the weight of continued attention from other tables. Conversations would stop when he passed, resume in whispered tones when he was gone. His anonymity, the one thing that had given him peace over the past 3 years, was completely gone. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Meet me at the Wellington pub, 2100 hours. Come alone. Blackwood. James stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it. He knew he should ignore it, should report to his commanding officer and request that any contact from his former unit be routed through proper channels. But something about Blackwood's earlier words about a special assignment had planted a seed of curiosity that he couldn't quite suppress. At 9 o'clock, he found himself walking through the doors of the Wellington, a pub frequented by military personnel from various London-based units. Blackwood sat alone at a corner table, 2 pints of beer already waiting. He looked exactly as James remembered, sharp eyes that missed nothing, the confident posture of a man accustomed to command, and the subtle tension that marked all veterans of special operations. "You came," Blackwood said as James approached. "Wasn't entirely certain you would." James sat down but didn't touch his beer. "What do you want, sir?" Direct as always. "I appreciate that about you, Mitchell." Blackwood leaned forward, his voice dropping to a level that wouldn't carry to neighboring tables. "Tell me, how have you been sleeping?" The question hit James like a physical blow. Sleep had been elusive for 3 years, filled with dreams of crosshairs and distant figures through telescopic sights. Well enough, really, because the James Mitchell I knew never could lie worth a damn. Blackwood studied him with the intense focus that had made him one of the most effective commanding officers in the regiment. The nightmares haven't stopped, have they? James remained silent, but his clenched jaw gave Blackwood all the answer he needed. "I thought so. You know, standing guard duty might have given you distance from active operations, but it hasn't given you peace." "How could it? You're a thoroughbred racehorse pulling a milk cart. The guards serve an important function." "Bollocks," Blackwood interrupted. "You're wasting away in ceremonial duties because you're afraid of who you really are. Today proved that your skills haven't diminished one bit. If anything, they've been refined by 3 years of enforced discipline." James finally picked up his beer, taking a long drink before responding. "Those skills came with a cost. You know that better than anyone." "Of course they did. Every precision instrument requires careful maintenance. That's why I'm here." Blackwood reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder, placing it on the table between them. "There's a situation that requires your specific expertise." Despite himself, James found his eyes drawn to the folder. "I'm not interested. You haven't heard what it is yet. I don't need to. Whatever it is, find someone else." Blackwood opened the folder slightly, revealing what appeared to be surveillance photographs. 3 British nationals are being held hostage in Syria. Aid workers who were captured while delivering medical supplies to refugee camps. The Foreign Office has been negotiating for their release for 6 weeks with no success. James kept his eyes fixed on Blackwood's face, refusing to look at the photographs. "Send in the SAS, that's what the regiment is for." "We can't. The location is too politically sensitive for a direct assault. But there might be another way." Blackwood turned one of the photographs so James could see it properly. The compound where they're being held has one vulnerability: a single window on the 3rd floor that provides a clear line of sight to the room where the hostages are kept. Despite his best intentions, James found himself looking at the photograph. It showed a concrete building surrounded by smaller structures, with the mentioned window clearly visible. His trained eye automatically began calculating angles, distances, and potential complications. The nearest suitable firing position is 1,400 meters away. Blackwood continued, across a valley with variable wind conditions and significant elevation differences. The shot would need to be made at dawn, when the guard rotation creates a 30-second window of opportunity. James pushed the photograph back across the table. "Find another sniper." "There is no other sniper. Not for this shot." Blackwood's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I've consulted with every marksman in British service. The consensus is unanimous. This shot is beyond the capability of anyone except you. That's not my problem anymore, isn't it?" Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying James with calculating eyes. "Tell me, what do you think about when you're standing guard at Buckingham Palace? When you're motionless for hours with nothing but your thoughts for company?" James felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. The truth was that those long hours of stillness were the worst part of his duty. Standing motionless gave his mind too much time to wander, to revisit moments from his past that he desperately wanted to forget. "I think about serving my country in a different way." "You think about Afghanistan," Blackwood said quietly, "about the shots you've made and the lives you've saved, about whether there's still a purpose for skills that you've spent years trying to suppress." The accuracy of the assessment was unsettling. James had indeed spent countless hours during guard duty wrestling with questions about purpose and identity, about whether his attempt to find peace was actually a form of cowardice. "These 3 hostages," Blackwood continued, opening the folder fully to reveal more detailed intelligence reports. "They're good people. Sarah Chen, a doctor from Manchester. David Williams, an engineer from Wales. Emma Thompson, a nurse from Scotland. They volunteered to work in one of the most dangerous places on Earth because they wanted to help people who had lost everything." James found himself looking at the personnel files despite his determination not to get involved. The photographs showed ordinary people: a young doctor with kind eyes, an engineer with calloused hands, a nurse whose smile suggested someone who had dedicated her life to caring for others. "They have families," Blackwood said softly. "People who love them and are praying for their safe return. The shot I'm asking you to make, it's not about politics or military objectives. It's about bringing 3 innocent people home." James closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. The answer is still no. But even as he said the words, he could feel something stirring inside him. Not bloodlust or the desire for action, but something more fundamental: the deeply ingrained need to protect innocent people that had driven him to join the military in the first place. James walked back to the barracks through the quiet London streets, his mind churning with images from the folder he had tried so hard to ignore. Despite his refusal, Blackwood had left the intelligence packet on the table, and James had found himself memorizing details even as he insisted he wasn't interested. The faces of the 3 hostages seemed burned into his memory, ordinary people whose only crime had been trying to help others. Back in his small quarters, James lay on his narrow bed staring at the ceiling. Outside, he could hear the distant sounds of London nightlife, but inside the barracks everything was quiet except for the occasional footstep in the corridor. Sleep, already elusive, seemed completely impossible tonight. He found himself thinking about the technical aspects of the shot Blackwood had described. 1,400 meters across a valley with variable wind conditions was certainly challenging, but not impossible. The elevation difference would require careful calculation, and the 30-second window meant there would be no opportunity for a ranging shot. Everything would have to be perfect on the first attempt. At 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and walked to the small kitchenette shared by his floor. As he made tea, he was surprised to find Guardsman Phillips sitting at the table, also apparently unable to sleep. "Couldn't rest either?" Phillips asked quietly. James nodded, sitting down across from the younger soldier. "What's keeping you awake?" "Honestly, what happened today at the range? I keep thinking about what you must have gone through, what you must have seen." Phillips paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "My brother served in Afghanistan with the Paras. He came back different. Wouldn't talk about what happened there, but you could see it in his eyes sometimes." James sipped his tea, saying nothing. "The thing is," Phillips continued, he said the hardest part wasn't the danger or the combat. It was coming home and trying to pretend that none of it mattered anymore, that he was just supposed to go back to being the person he was before. The observation was more perceptive than James had expected from someone so young. "How is your brother now?" "Better. It took time, but he found work with a veterans charity. Says helping other soldiers adjust gave him a sense of purpose again." Phillips looked directly at James. "Maybe that's what everyone needs, a sense that what they've been through actually meant something." After Phillips left, James sat alone in the kitchen, the young man's words echoing in his mind. For 3 years, he had tried to convince himself that ceremonial duties were meaningful, that protecting the traditions and symbols of Britain was important work. But if he was honest, he had never felt the same sense of purpose that had driven him during his operational tours. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the barracks. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison approached James during morning inspection with a grave expression. "Mitchell, there's someone here to see you. Conference room B, immediately." James found Sarah Chen's mother waiting for him, a small, dignified woman in her 60s, whose eyes held the kind of pain that only comes from having a child in mortal danger. She stood as he entered, extending a hand that trembled slightly. "Sergeant Mitchell, I'm Linda Chen. I believe you've been told about my daughter's situation." James felt his carefully constructed emotional barriers beginning to weaken. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm the right person." "Please," she interrupted gently. "Just let me say what I came to say." She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. Sarah Chen in medical scrubs, smiling as she posed with a group of refugee children. This was taken 2 weeks before she was captured. She had just finished treating a little girl who had been injured in a bombing. Sarah wrote to me that night, saying she had never felt more certain about her purpose in life. Mrs. Chen's voice remained steady, but James could see the effort it required. "My daughter chose to go to Syria because she believed that her skills could save lives. She knew the dangers, but she went anyway because she couldn't live with herself knowing that people were suffering when she had the ability to help. She placed the photograph on the table between them. "Colonel Blackwood told me about you, about your capabilities. He said that if anyone could bring Sarah and the others home safely, it would be you." James stared at the photograph, seeing not just Sarah Chen, but every civilian he had protected during his tours in Afghanistan. The faces of people who had risked everything to help others, who had trusted British forces to keep them safe. "Mrs. Chen, I understand your desperation, but I'm not here to beg," she said firmly. "I'm here to ask you to consider what my daughter would want. She risked her life to save strangers because she believed that some things are worth the risk. I think she would understand if you felt the same way about bringing her home." After Mrs. Chen left, James found himself walking through Hyde Park, trying to process the emotions that her visit had stirred up. He thought about Phillips's words about purpose, about the 3 years he had spent trying to suppress the very skills that had once defined him. His phone buzzed with another message from Blackwood. "The window of opportunity is closing. Decision needed within 24 hours. That evening, James called his sister Emma, the only family member who knew the full truth about his service record. She lived in Edinburgh with her husband and 2 young children, and their weekly conversations had been one of the constants that had helped him maintain his sanity over the past 3 years. "James, I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight. Is everything all right?" He told her about the shooting competition, about Blackwood's appearance, and about the mission he was being asked to undertake. Emma listened without interruption, asking only occasional clarifying questions. "So the question is," she said finally, "whether you're ready to be that person again. I'm not sure I ever stopped being that person. Maybe I just convinced myself I had. What does your gut tell you?" James thought about Mrs. Chen's dignified courage, about the photograph of her daughter with the refugee children, about 3 innocent people whose lives hung in the balance. "That I can't live with myself if I don't at least try." Then you have your answer. That night, James sat down and wrote a letter to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, requesting immediate leave for personal reasons. Then he wrote another letter, this one to Blackwood, with just 4 words. "I'm in. When do we leave?" 48 hours later, James found himself in a nondescript office building in Vauxhall, being briefed on what would officially never happen. The room contained the familiar faces of an SAS operational team, men he had served with before, who greeted him with the kind of understated acknowledgement that marked professionals who trusted each other with their lives. "Good to have you back, mate," said Staff Sergeant Kelly, the team's communications specialist. "Even if it's just for one shot." The mission briefing was thorough and sobering. The hostage compound was located in a valley outside Aleppo, controlled by a splinter group that had proven resistant to both negotiation and conventional rescue attempts. Intelligence indicated that the 3 British nationals were being held in a 3rd-floor room under guard, rotation that created a brief window of vulnerability. "Each dawn, the shot is complex," explained Captain Davies, the mission commander. 1,400 meters across uneven terrain, with a significant elevation differential and prevailing winds that shift direction around sunrise. You'll have exactly 30 seconds when the guard rotation creates a clear line of sight to the target. James studied the detailed topographical maps and satellite imagery, his mind automatically calculating angles and compensations. "What's the extraction plan?" "Fast and light. Helicopter insertion 12 kilometers from the target. Approach on foot during darkness. You take the shot at dawn, then immediate extraction to a secondary pickup point. Time on target? Approximately 6 hours from insertion to extraction, assuming everything goes according to plan." Blackwood, who had remained silent during most of the briefing, leaned forward. "There's one more thing, Mitchell. The guard you'll be targeting isn't just any terrorist. Intelligence identifies him as Ahmad Hassan, the group's second-in-command and the person most responsible for the hostage's capture." James nodded, understanding the implication. This wasn't just about creating an opportunity for rescue. It was about eliminating a high-value target whose death would significantly impact the organization's operational capability. The team flew out that evening on a military transport, the familiar routine of pre-mission preparations helping James slip back into the mindset he had tried so hard to leave behind. He cleaned and checked his rifle with the methodical precision of someone whose life had once depended on mechanical perfection, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought left off. During the flight, he found himself thinking about the guards at Buckingham Palace who would be wondering about his sudden absence. Phillips and the others would probably assume he had been reassigned, never suspecting that their quiet colleague was flying toward one of the most dangerous regions in the world. The helicopter insertion went smoothly, the team landing in darkness on a rocky plateau that provided concealment, while remaining within striking distance of their objective. James felt the familiar weight of his equipment as they began the approach march. The precision rifle that had been his companion through 3 tours, the specialized ammunition selected for maximum accuracy at extreme range, and the electronic devices that would help him calculate environmental factors. "How are you feeling?" asked Captain Davies as they paused during the approach. "Like I never left," James replied, surprised by the honesty of his answer. As they moved through the pre-dawn darkness, James realized that Phillips had been right about purpose. For 3 years he had felt like he was drifting, going through the motions of service without the clear sense of mission that had once driven him. Now, with innocent lives hanging in the balance and his unique skills once again relevant, he felt more like himself than he had since leaving the regiment. The team reached the firing position with 2 hours to spare before the planned shot. James set up his rifle with careful precision, using a laser rangefinder to confirm the distance and checking wind direction with a portable weather station. 1,437 meters to the target window, with a crosswind that would require significant compensation. "Target acquired," he reported quietly into his radio. Beginning final preparations. Through his scope, he could see the compound clearly in the growing dawnlight. The building looked exactly as described in the intelligence briefings: concrete, construction with the critical third-floor window providing a clear view into what satellite imagery had identified as the hostage room. "Overwatch reports guard rotation. Beginning," crackled Davies' voice through his earpiece. 30 seconds on my mark." James controlled his breathing, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. In the distance, he could see movement in the target window as the guard rotation began. For a moment, he thought about Mrs. Chen and her daughter's photograph, about 3 innocent people whose freedom depended on his ability to make an impossible shot. 10 seconds, Davies announced. James's world narrowed to the crosshairs in his scope and the calculations running through his mind. Wind speed, bullet drop, target movement, timing. Everything had to be perfect. 5 seconds. The target appeared in the window, a bearded man in military fatigues who matched the description of Ahmad Hassan. James could see him clearly through the scope, unaware that 1,400 meters away, a former royal guard was preparing to end his life. Execute. James squeezed the trigger with the smooth, steady pressure that had become second nature over years of training in combat. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the suppressor reducing but not eliminating the sound of the shot. Through his scope, he watched the target collapse, the precisely placed round having found its mark with lethal accuracy. "Target down," he reported, already beginning to pack his equipment. Shot confirmed. The extraction proceeded exactly as planned, the team moving quickly to the secondary pickup point while radio intercepts confirmed that the compound was in chaos following Hassan's death. Within 6 hours of taking the shot, James was back aboard the transport aircraft watching the Syrian landscape disappear beneath them. "Outstanding work," Captain Davies said as they flew toward the debrief. "Initial reports suggest the rescue operation was successful. All 3 hostages recovered alive and unharmed." James nodded, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. The mission had been successful, the hostages were safe, and he had proven to himself that his skills remained sharp despite 3 years away from operational duty. But questions remained about what came next, about whether this single mission marked a return to his old life, or simply a temporary departure from his new one. 3 weeks later, James stood once again at his post outside Buckingham Palace, wearing the familiar red tunic and bearskin hat that had been his uniform for 3 years. To the tourists taking photographs and the passing pedestrians, he appeared exactly as he always had, motionless, professional, unremarkable. But everything had changed. The mission had remained officially classified, with no public acknowledgement of his role in the hostage rescue. The 3 aid workers had been quietly repatriated, their families reunited, and the incident filed away in the secret archives of successful special operations. As far as the world knew, Sergeant James Mitchell of the Royal Guards had simply taken a brief leave of absence. But the story had not ended there. On his first day back at guard duty, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had called him into his office with an expression that mixed confusion and respect. "Mitchell, I've received some rather unusual correspondence regarding your recent leave," Harrison had said, holding up an official document bearing impressive letterheads. "It seems you've been recommended for recognition of your service." Though the specifics remain classified, James had said nothing, maintaining the same neutral expression he had perfected during 3 years of ceremonial duty. "There's also been a request," Harrison continued, "from certain parties who remain unnamed, asking whether you might be available for similar assignments in the future. Apparently, your particular skill set has been deemed valuable for ongoing operations." The offer had been exactly what James had expected. Blackwood and the SAS wanted him back, either as a full-time return to special operations or as an on-call specialist for missions requiring extreme precision marksmanship. It was the opportunity to reclaim his identity as one of Britain's elite soldiers, to return to work that utilized his unique talents. He had turned it down. The decision had surprised everyone, including himself. During the flight back from Syria, he had been certain that the mission marked his return to operational duty. The satisfaction of successfully completing such a challenging shot, the knowledge that his actions had directly saved innocent lives, the sense of purpose that came from using his skills in service of something greater than himself, all of it had pointed toward resuming his career with the regiment. But something had changed during those quiet hours standing guard after his return. Phillips's words about finding purpose had taken on new meaning, and James had realized that his 3 years with the Guards had taught him something important about service that went beyond combat effectiveness. The answer had come to him during a chance encounter outside the barracks. Mrs. Chen had appeared one evening as he finished his duty shift, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Sergeant Mitchell," she had said, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude, "I wanted to thank you personally, though I understand I can never know the details of what you did." Inside the package was the photograph of her daughter with the refugee children, along with a handwritten letter from Sarah Chen herself. The letter spoke of her gratitude not just for her rescue, but for the knowledge that there were people willing to risk everything to protect others. She had written about her intention to return to humanitarian work, about how the experience had strengthened rather than weakened her commitment to helping those in need. "She wants to go back," Mrs. Chen had explained, "not to Syria, but to other places where her skills can save lives. She says that knowing people like you exist makes her feel brave enough to keep trying to make a difference." That conversation had crystallized something James had been struggling to understand. His value wasn't just in his ability to eliminate threats or complete impossible missions. It was in being someone who stood ready to protect those who chose to put themselves at risk for others. The aid workers, the peacekeepers, the ordinary people who made extraordinary choices because they believed the world could be better. Now, as he stood at his post with perfect military bearing, James understood that his role with the Guards was not a step down from his former elite status. It was a different kind of elite service. He was the quiet professional who tourists photographed without realizing they were looking at one of the deadliest marksmen in British military history. He was the ceremonial guard who had traded public recognition for the private satisfaction of knowing he remained ready to act when innocent lives hung in the balance. His phone contained several encrypted messages from Blackwood, each offering increasingly attractive terms for his return to active special operations. James had read them all but responded to none. The SAS would always be part of who he was, but it no longer defined who he chose to be. During his break, he found Phillips in the mess hall, the young guardsman looking up with the mixture of respect and curiosity that had characterized their interaction since the shooting competition. "How was Syria?" Phillips asked quietly. James paused with his tea halfway to his lips. "I'm sorry?" "Come on, mate. 3 weeks of sudden leave right after a mysterious colonel shows up asking about special assignments? We're not stupid." Phillips grinned. "Besides, you came back different. More settled somehow, like you figured something out." James considered his response carefully. Sometimes a person needs to remember who they are before they can decide who they want to be. And who do you want to be? James looked around the mess hall at his fellow guardsmen, ordinary soldiers who had chosen to serve their country in ways that rarely made headlines or earned recognition. They stood motionless for hours in all weather, maintaining traditions that connected modern Britain to centuries of military heritage. They did their duty without expectation of glory, finding meaning in service itself rather than in the recognition it might bring. "I want to be someone who's ready when he's needed," James said finally, "whether that's standing guard at Buckingham Palace or making an impossible shot to save innocent lives." Phillips nodded, understanding more than his age might have suggested. "My brother would say that's the definition of a real soldier." That evening, as James walked back to his quarters, his phone buzzed with a new message. This one wasn't from Blackwood or anyone else connected to special operations. It was from Sarah Chen, sent through channels he couldn't quite identify, but suspected involved official gratitude at very high levels. The message was simple. "Thank you for giving me the chance to keep helping people. I hope you find peace in knowing that your courage makes it possible for others to be brave." James deleted the message and continued walking, his steps steady and sure. Tomorrow, he would return to his post outside Buckingham Palace, standing guard over traditions and symbols that represented the best of what his country aspired to be. Tourists would take his photograph without knowing his story. Other soldiers would see him as just another ceremonial guard, and the world would continue to turn without recognizing the quiet professional who stood ready to answer when extraordinary circumstances demanded extraordinary skills. It was exactly the kind of service he had learned to value. Meaningful work done without expectation of recognition, protection offered to those who would never know they had been protected, and the satisfaction that came from being precisely who and what he chose to be, regardless of what others might think they knew about him. The quiet royal guard had found his peace at last, not by abandoning who he had been, but by integrating all aspects of his service into a single, coherent identity. He was simultaneously the ceremonial soldier who honored tradition and the deadly marksman who protected the innocent, the visible guardian of British heritage and the invisible protector of British values. And if the day ever came when impossible shots needed to be made again, he would be ready.